Two things then to summarize Hamlet's approach to thinking. First, he recognizes the limits of his own perception. Second, he shows a humble willingness to question his own thinking. So we're going to look then at how he uses this methodology to think about death. So the rest of this presentation then is going to be focused on looking at Hamlet's thinking applied to death from the beginning of the play to the end of the play. There's lots of quotes in here, which would be of great service to you in this paper that you guys are going to be writing soon. Essentially, you could see this as me almost modeling like an outline for a paper. And the cool thing about what happens when you learn in the classroom is that the stuff that I tell you isn't really mine. I don't have any like copyright claim over my ideas, because as a teacher, when I share my ideas, they quickly become your ideas, and you're allowed to use them to whatever degree you'd like. So obviously, I don't want you to simply write a paper that's a complete copy of what I'm going to present to you, but I'd encourage you to pull from class notes throughout this entire study of Hamlet to strengthen your own arguments in the papers that you're writing. So then, first of all, Hamlet's thinking applied to death, looking at Act 1. In Act 1, we have almost this hyperbolic wish for death in the midst of Hamlet's despair. In his first soliloquy, he wishes for death, wishes that his flesh would melt and resolve itself into a dew. His view of death itself seems to be based in a Judeo-Christian vision of the afterlife. His father tells him that he's in purgatory, and Hamlet, in already speaking about death, has wished that the Almighty had not fixed his hand against self-slaughter. It seems to be borrowing a lot of language in and around a way that a Christianized Denmark might have thought about these issues. After his ghostly father tells him to move forward, we see an eagerness to revenge him. This eagerness, of course, will be largely missing from the remainder of the play. But originally, he responds with a willingness and a speed to see his father revenged. Moving into the second act, we've already talked about what a piece of work is man and the gray-colored lenses with which Hamlet views the world. We also see towards the end of this a thoughtful and humble rebuke of himself for his inaction. After listening to the player deliver his speech about Hecuba, Hamlet says, "This is most brave," sarcastic towards himself, and comparing himself here to a prostitute who must unpack his heart with words. And so the question that's implied here is really, well, what's his hang-up? Why won't he pursue revenge? He's criticizing himself for not doing this. Why doesn't he just do this? To be or not to be really functions as the centerpiece for Hamlet's central flaw, which many scholars argue is his hesitation. We don't see really like greed or pride or other kinds of things in Hamlet, which make him seem to be a little bit more of a pure hero than some other tragic heroes. What we do see, though, is a hesitation. So here's his holdup. This is the thing that is really the crux of Hamlet's thinking. On the right here are two sections from his To Be or Not to Be soliloquy. In the first part, he says, "Who would fardels, which is burdens, bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will." You'll remember from our study of this soliloquy that Hamlet here has now changed some of that Judeo-Christian vision of the afterlife to a pagan, sort of Greek and Roman mythological vision of an undiscovered country. And he says this: who in the world is going to put up with these burdens, except we don't know what's next? And there's a fear, a dread of what that next thing is, and it puzzles our will. And so he concludes, thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their current turns awry and lose the name of action. What he's saying here is this fear, and what really is a clearly paralyzing fear of death, forces us to ask, how do we live knowing that we will die? And Hamlet says most of us just are afraid, and we lose the name of action. We don't do anything because we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do with the fact that we'll die. If you think about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which you read a couple modules back, Prufrock said, "I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. For Prufrock, he says, my life is meaningless, and it should just be meaningless, obsolete, redundant, silly, irrelevant, something that's just under the deepest, darkest ocean, a small old crab running furiously in the dark and in the emptiness. Hamlet seems to suggest that's how many of us live. Many of us live these kinds of boring and complacent and meaningless lives because if we were really thinking about it, we'd be too afraid to actually do anything because complacency perhaps is easier. Hamlet right now in this soliloquy he's facing death, and he's recognizing perhaps that if he's really going to avenge his father, if he's really going to try to assassinate the reigning king of Denmark, he's going to need to be willing to die. And the clear question here is, who can possibly be willing to die? Who's excited about death, or who's ready for death? How could you possibly be ready when you don't know what's after it, if there is anything after it, and you don't really understand the importance of it? You've never been dead. And so how do you act knowing that this is a barrier that you must inevitably face, but that, of course, everybody is terrified to actually face?